part one of how the oasis of Yathrib came to be seen as the holy city of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, Dr. Munt explained how the concept of sacred space in late antiquity, particularly those within the Ḥijāzī Arabian context known as a Haram and ḥimā, were created and functioned. He had also went over in part one the moment in which the Prophet Muhammad first established a Haram in the valley of Yathrib, as mentioned in the document famously titled the Constitution of Medina. Part one closed with Dr. Munt describing his research into the scholarly debates concerning the nature of the Haram in Medina, which included debates about its status, ritualistic requirements, and overall existence after the passing of the Prophet's generation. In this installment, part two of how the oasis of Yathrib came to be seen as the holy city of the Prophet Muhammad, we are going to put the Haram on a shelf until the last part of this segment, where I hope we can explore some of the reasons for why the Prophet established a Haram in the oasis in the first place. But as for the topic that will transpire at this very moment concerning the process by which Yathrib became a sacred city, I believe it is best to resume where the second half of your book actually starts, and that's on the topography of Yathrib / Medina. In this part, I kind of get stuck on, should I still call it Yathrib or should I call it Medina? So if I call it Yathrib / Medina for a bit, just work with me because I might just end up calling it Medina towards the end. And how certain sites were commemorated in Medina for being connected to the career of the Prophet as described in the literature of scholars and from the construction of monuments initiated by caliphs. So, but first, for our audience, how do you define topography? Looking at a definition from Google, I found it hard to distinguish between that and geography. And I noticed that in your book, you were aware of the shortcomings involved with using the word landscape instead. So, but whilst you used it anyway. So, I guess to change the initial question a bit, what is the most fitting definition for the word topography?
Yeah, I guess I was. Yeah, it's a good question. I guess I was grappling with the question of thinking about places have a sort of natural landscape, if you like, but they also then have the meaning that gets put onto that by the communities that live there, visit there, work there, etc. And what I was trying to get at in this discussion is topography in the sense of the meaning that's given to it by the community that lived there or communities that had an interest in Medina. So it can be built topography. So it can be buildings like the Prophet's Mosque or other mosques, other quarters, other structures that get added to give meaning to the place, or it can be ideas about natural features, so wadis, mountains. We talked a little bit about the tracts of volcanic rocks around Medina last time and how meaning gets given to those. For example, as we discussed previously in the demarcation of the Haram boundaries. So by topography, I mean to look at the ways in which people gave meaning to Medina's space and landscape, either through buildings and patronizing building works, or through discussing it in the case in the book, mostly in works of local history.
Okay. Yeah, because I was a bit confused by, was it natural constructions that might be on the landscape or in the area, or was it something that was maybe man-made, built by the hands of individuals? Um,
I
but
guess
you also, oh no, I'm sorry.
I guess it's both.
Okay. And you
Yeah.
also had mentioned, and the reason why I was a bit confused because you had mentioned that some of the places that the topographical works mentioned, there weren't really any tangible, or you questioned, were there any tangible sites there to begin with? Maybe I'm kind of jumping the gun a little bit and we can get to that later. But just the topography, a new word introduced into my vocabulary, just kind of threw me for a loop. But what I would like to get into the principal sources you used for the topographical information on Medina. There's one work detailing the topography of Medina that I've taken a great interest in lately, and one you appear to have relied on heavily, just by judging from how frequently you cited it throughout your own work. And that is the Wafa al-Wafa by Al-Samhudi. I only became aware of this work maybe several months ago, but since then it seems to pop up everywhere as a principal source for any serious study on Medina. So for those of us who may be in the dark as to who Al-Samhudi was, and on what the Wafa al-Wafa is about. Can you give us a short introduction to the author, his work, and its importance pertaining to your own research?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, as you said, this was an absolutely vital source for my own research. Samhudi is quite relative to the period that my book is about. He's quite a late scholar, so he's really a scholar of the 9th century Hijri, the 15th century CE. He's from Egypt originally,
Mm.
from Samhud
Hence the
in
name.
Upper Egypt, and spent so his early sort of formative educational years in Egypt, both in his hometown, but also in Cairo, and then he goes on pilgrimage to Mecca, and through a sort of as a reasonably young man, and through a slightly convoluted set of reasons, ends up staying in Medina.
Mm.
And while in Medina, he's a scholar he becomes a scholar who writes works and teaches on a reasonably wide range of different topics, but for our discussion, his local history of Medina is the most important work, and I think it is fair to say that's the work he was most famous for. He composed what he tells us was a much bigger work than the one that survives. But while he was away from Medina in the very late 15th century, there was a huge fire in the Prophet's Mosque in Medina, and quite a lot of it suffered very serious damage. And part of the damage was his big history of Medina, which he tells us was destroyed in the fire.
Did he rewrite
Yeah,
the?
well, he'd been working on an. By that time, it was reasonably popular for historians, well, especially it seemed local historians of the Hijaz to write like several stages of a work. So they would have a big version and then several smaller versions. And so Samhudi had this big work which was lost, but he had already been working on an abridgment of it.
Okay.
And it's that you were referring to, the Wafa al-Wafa, that survives. There's an abridgment of that as well. There's an even smaller work that
Yeah, because I
survives
think
as
the
well.
one I've seen now is like 5 volumes.
Yeah, so the modern edition of the Wafa is 5 volumes. There's another one called the Khulasat al-Wafa, which survives in 2 volumes. So there are sort of successive stages, but what we have are the Wafa al-Wafa is the most important one. And it's a local history of Medina. It discusses a huge number of topics. I can't, off the top of my head, I can't think of the exact organization of it, but it starts with sort of traditions about the names of the place, and where all these different names come from, and traditions in praise of Medina. It provides some history of the pre-Islamic period and the arrival of the Prophet in the area. And then it provides a sort of topographically focused history. So it moves through, it gives a history, for example, of the Prophet's Mosque, and the various stages in the development of the Prophet's Mosque, from the Prophet's own time down to Samhudi's own time. It discusses other sites in the town and in the surrounding area, so other mosques that were built. It discusses natural features as well, so wadis, mountains, etc. It discusses practices of pilgrimage to Medina. And in all these sections, you also get little bits and pieces of information about sort of major events that have happened in the town as well. So for example, in the history of the Prophet's Mosque, there are plenty of references to events where people came to Medina for other reasons but ended up doing something to the Prophet's Mosque or something like that. So you get lots of history of Medina collectively as well. Now, as I said, it's a very late source compared to the period that I'm working on. It was written 700, 600, 700, 800 years after the events I'm discussing. The reason it's so important for me, not only, Samhudi was, I do think, was quite an interesting historian himself, but he also had access to a wide range of earlier sources on the history of Medina, that most of which no longer survive. So he had access to a work by a Basran, an Iraqi, called Omar ibn Shabba, and a bit of Ibn Shabba's work does survive as well. And so we can see that Samhudi used that work in various ways, but he also had access to works that no longer survive. I guess the single most important work was written at the very end of the 2nd century Hijri, in 199 Hijri, about very early 9th century CE, by a historian called Ibn Zabala. Ibn Zabala was a Medinan. He seems, I mean, we don't hear too much about his biography, but what we do have locates him very firmly in Medina his whole life, it would seem.
And he was a student of the famous jurist Malik ibn Anas.
He was, yes, he was a
Okay.
student. He was a direct student of Malik, so he had those scholarly connections within Medina as well, and he composed a local history of Medina, Akhbar al-Medina, and this work, as I say, doesn't survive, but later sources quote quite extensively from it, and including Samhudi. Samhudi cites it as his source of information on, I think if I remember rightly, it's over 600 times.
Mm.
So it's a huge number of citations. So from a work like Samhudi, not only is Samhudi's work interesting and important in and of itself, but we also learn about the lost sort of local historical tradition in Medina as well from works like his.
Yeah, I heard it's a very interesting work. I'm surprised in all of my reading into Muslim history, Islamic history, especially into the Arabian Peninsula. I've never come across Al-Samhudi until a friend of mine turned me on to his Michael Lecker's work, and
Yeah.
I saw that in a interview he had mentioned the importance of his work, and since then popped up in your work. I have another friend using his work to write a book, and seems like I can't stop seeing him. And so, what other history? There were other important histories Al Samhudi incorporated into his work that are no longer extant. But I do have a question about the Ibn Shaba, the work of Ibn Shaba. Do we have that? Is that still extant, or is that no longer extant?
So it, I suppose it's best to say it's partially extant.
Okay.
Um, so it's a manuscript survives of a work by Ibn Shaba,
Mhm.
and it's quite long. I mean, there's a modern edition of it in two vol. The most recent modern edition is in 2 volumes, so it's quite long. What survives, but
Oh,
it
is it?
definitely isn't the whole work. So we don't have the beginning of the work. The surviving manuscript starts in the middle of a sentence. We don't. So at least some pages, or at least a page has been a folio has been lost from the beginning. But it's it starts in the middle of it starts at the very end of a discussion of the Prophet's mosque. So presumably we're missing a whole section discussing that structure at least.
So was that's probably like a huge a part of the context missing to
Yeah, so I think there's
understand
quite a
the
lot.
words.
Yeah, so there's quite a lot missing. What does survive again it survives. I guess it can be divided into three parts. There's a sort of topographical history of Medina. So I said we get the tail end of the discussion of the Prophet's Mosque, and then it moves into discussing other mosques, other features, various people's estates around like where they had their residences, where they had estates that they made money from around the town, etc., etc., and lots of information about the Prophet's career and things the Prophet got up to in Medina. And then it has a section on the Caliphate of Omar, the second caliph, and then the Caliphate of Othman, the third caliph. So and then it breaks and then it ends again. So quite a lot survives, but it's definitely not the whole work that survives. Whatever was originally there was clearly a bit larger, at least, than what has survived.
And his focus was pretty much the same as Ibn Zabala. Was he not a student of his, or
He was supposed to have been a student of Ibn Zabala, yes, although he doesn't seem to use him as a source too much in his
yeah, tends to
in
turn
his
to Abu
work.
Ghassan? Or
Yeah, he uses his major source is a almost exact contemporary of Ibn Zabala's
Hmm.
called Abu Ghassan, another Medinan, another person who seems to have moved in exactly the same circles as Ibn Zabala, who possibly composed a local history of his own. We don't know that, but at the very least, he obviously taught people like Ibn Shabba a lot of local historical information. So we do have slightly different um, sources for the history of Medina in this period between Ibn Zabala as preserved by later sources like Samhudi, and then Abu Ghassan as his material alongside others was used by historians like Ibn Shabba.
Okay, and I do have a few more questions about the topographical sources. I don't want to get caught up, or as they say, miss the forest for the trees, because I do find a lot of this information very interesting. But I would like to ask about Al-Zubair bin Bakr. Was he only known as a redactor of the Akbar al-Madina, or is there anything distinct about his scholarship aside from that?
He he seems to have been a major. So he again was a student of Ibn Zabala.
Mm.
He seems to have played a very important role in transmitting Ibn Zabala's work. Most later historians who who knew of Ibn Zabala's Akhbar al-Medina seem to have known it in the version that was put together by Zubayr ibn Bakr. So he seems to have been very important in that regard. He was also a very important scholar in his own right. A couple of surviving works by him, one on the genealogy of Quraysh, for example, survive. So Zubayr was an important historian in his own right. And he also seems to have either composed some works of his own on Medina that were a bit different to Ibn Zabala's, or he added material of his own to his redaction of Ibn Zabala's work. He is known as an authority on some regions. There's one of the wordies that runs so along the west of the town, the Wadi Laqiq. It was along this wadi quite a lot of local elites had their residences. And so Zubayr ibn Bakr is from what we modern historians call the Zubayrid family. He's a descendant of the Prophet's companion Az-Zubayr. And so his family were one of the prominent families in Medina. And he's an authority in this region in which a lot of Zubayrids and other elites had their residences. So he does seem to have been a historian of his own as well of Medina.
Okay, and just the last one who seemed to have been a principal source for Al-Samhudi, and it has the same name as Ibn Zabala's work. Maybe that's not its name. Akbar al-Medina by Abu Hussein Yahya al-Lakiki. And just his work is tends to kind of depart from, I mean, I guess if you were to draw a Venn diagram, all of the works mentioned would have a lot of overlap, but Al-Akiki seems to kind of depart from his predecessors in his main focus on his work. Can you just describe that for a bit, if I understood it correctly?
Yeah, sure. Yahya al-Akiki is so he's actually he's an Alid. He's a descendant of Ali. I think, if I remember rightly, he's a descendant of the fourth Imam Zain al-Abidin. So he's from, again, that prestigious family, which again, of course, is one of the main local families in Medina. In his time, he's again a generation or two later than Ibn Zabala. We know that his history, which again, his history doesn't survive. It survives through hundreds of quotations in later sources like Samhudi's. We know he used Ibn Zabala's history, but he seems to have focused more, not exclusively on the Prophet's Mosque and topics like, so the Prophet's Mosque and then the Prophet's grave and other features associated with that mosque. But he seems to have, he at least was used by later historians more exclusively for his material on those sites.
Was he a student of Al-Zubair? Was there any connection? I sparsely remember if there was anything between them, which I
remember off the
found
top of my head.
interesting. One being a Zubair, the other one being an Alid.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. He does use Ibn Zabala's work as a source, and he is cited as using Ibn Zabala's history. I think, if I remember, he's too young to have studied directly with Ibn Zabala. He's at least 2 generations later. Okay. So Az-Zubayr probably was the intermediary. He probably was the intermediary.
Okay, and I just found the diversity of these sources used by Al-Samhudi to be very interesting. One being a Zubayrid, the other, one being a Zubayrid, another being a student of Malik ibn Anas, another one being an Alid, and whatnot. But I will, concerning the histories you had mentioned, something very interesting, but didn't go too much into detail. And that is on the local histories of Medina not being like the works you'd find for other towns of this period. So what makes the local histories of Medina distinct from the local histories of other Islamic towns and cities?
Yeah, what I was driving at there is they're not completely distinctive, but there are quite a lot of local histories written about cities across the cities, regions across the Islamic world, at least from the 3rd century Hijri, the 9th century CE onwards. And they can often be, for example, histories of events that took place in a town or region, or they can be histories of local scholars. or other particularly prominent local individuals, for example. There's sort of biographical work, like compilations of biographies of local scholars or some such group. But in the Medina, and actually in the Hijaz more broadly, so the same applies to histories of Mecca, they don't focus really on providing potted biographies of local scholars, nor on providing histories of events. They tend to focus on histories of sites in the town's topographies. So they focus more on, so for Medina, sites like the history of the Prophet's Mosque or the history of other mosques in the town, rather than, you know, in this year this happened, then in this year this happened, then in this year this happened, or in providing biographies of local individuals. So that's what I was focusing on there. In this early period, there does seem to be a bit of a distinction between the way that history gets written for places like the Hijaz and the ways it gets written for some of the other towns and regions that we see local histories being written for. And I think that says something about the importance of understandings of topography to Medinans and Meccans at this time. They clearly saw the foundation of their communities as based around these sites that were connected with the memory of the Prophet and his companions.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a important point to keep in mind as you continue to read through your book, the intentions of the people in the literature, why they may have visited some of these sites, and then how those actions were interpreted later. And as I've already mentioned, I don't want to miss the forest for the trees by inquiring too much into the nature of the sources, but I would like to ask a question based on something I read from a review of your book by Zeta Antrim. I hope I didn't butcher that name. She had mentioned that it would have quote, it would have been illuminating to know more about how you would have assessed the sources in and of themselves, as well as the later context which within they emerged, unquote. Even though I kind of added some words in there that wasn't in the quote. But what sources she meant exactly is something I couldn't determine. But for me, at least concerning the local histories of Medina, I am curious as to what kind of an impact you believe the context in which these works emerged and from whom they emerged had on the author and content. If maybe to clarify my question a little bit more, take Ibn Sabala, for example. You have mentioned that later local historians of Medina did not cite him as a source for the graves of the martyrs at the Battle of Uhud, and that concerning the commemorative sites around Medina, Ibn Zabala gave no privileged status to the grave of the Prophet above any other site. Unlike Yahya al-Hakiki, who did seem to focus on the grave of the Prophet more so than his predecessors. So I guess what I'm trying to figure out, maybe, and I know you mentioned that there was debates about the grave of the Prophet and visitation to it, which we'll talk about later on. But I was wondering if maybe in the time of Ibn Zabala that was a debate, and he kind of leaned towards one side more than the other, while you have within the same, you mentioned Yahya al-Hakiki might have been a couple generations after Ibn Zabala, but I was wondering if the conversation had more so swung towards his direction and how maybe the general consensus looked at visiting the grave of the Prophet.
Yeah, I think these are interesting questions. That the obvious caveat is that because these works, the main ones that you're talking about here, don't survive, it's harder to. I suppose it's harder to say definitively they didn't talk about something, right? It might just be that later historians didn't quote them on it. That in itself might be significant. So Samhudi has very extensive discussions of the Prophet's grave in his history. Ibn Zabala is not non-existent as a source in that section, but he's a more minor source for that section. So that doesn't mean Ibn Zabala didn't talk about the Prophet's grave. It might mean Samhudi didn't think that what he had to say was worth repeating, which of course itself might be interesting. But because they don't survive, we don't really know. I think in relation to that topic in particular, as maybe we'll get onto, I think you do see a growth, especially in the period between Ibn Zabala and Yahya al-Hakiki, and then a bit after Yahya as well, a kind of century and a half after Ibn Zabala. You see a growth in interest in the Prophet's tomb. not so, or at least the topic of how to think about treat the prophet's tomb as a pilgrimage destination, for example. That's where, so I think you do see developments, and I think that it is very important then to think about the fact that all these historians were not writing in the same contexts. They were writing at different times. Ideas, of course, develop over time. So it would be a bit strange if they had exactly the same opinions about exactly the same topics 100 years apart.
Yeah.
So you do see developments, and I do think the contexts in which they're writing is important. So, for example, I do think the fact that Ibn Zabala is associated with the circle of Malik, as you mentioned, is quite important. I think Malik is famous for making certain claims about the authority of Medina's scholars in the field of Islamic law, and I think you can see Ibn Zabala's history as supporting Malik's argument that Medina's scholars have a particular importance because they are based in the place where the Prophet and his companions lived and acted, and what they did was transmitted through successive generations in Medina. And Ibn Zabala's relentless focus on sites associated with all these people can be seen as a historical justification for those ideas. I think all these context issues are important, yeah, and they do change between them. So some of the issues we'll get onto might show some of the ways in which people like Ibn Zabala or Yahya did clearly think differently about issues. And then, of course, by the time these sources survive in quotations in work like Samhudi's, attitudes have changed completely again. So there's lots of layers to unpick there.
All right. Well, hopefully, moving forward, you have enough time in your scholarship. Maybe you might be the one to unpick them and deliver that in another monograph. But okay, so I'm not going to repeat this phrase again, forest from the trees, but I really had to keep reminding myself, like, to scope out a bit and not just zoom in on certain little minute details concerning your book, but yeah, the reason for you mentioning the topographical works before the monumental building of the caliphs really was something I didn't understand at first. I had to like go back, and then I figured out, okay, wait, the scholars writing about the topography came way later than the caliphs that were writing. But in your book, you had mentioned the topographical sources first. So I almost, without looking at the death dates, got the impression that the scholars laid the foundation for the commemorative sites, and then the caliphs came along after and started building. But that was just my own negligence, or just not being aware of what I was reading. But yeah, the main point of you mentioning the topographical sources were because of the monumental building that they relay about the caliphs who built. So just to catch up with my notes for a second. All right, so starting with the Rashidun caliphs, do we have anything from the local histories of Medina as evidence of them giving patronage to certain sites around Medina due to their connection with the life of the Prophet Muhammad?
Perhaps just if I can just clarify on the point you just made, yes, the reason I talk about the local histories and their topographical discussions is partly because, yeah, they are the main sources for the information about Caliphal works in the region. The reason I discussed them first was to make the point, if you like, about context, that they're interested in certain topics, and caliphs or anyone else might have done work in other contexts, but the local historians just weren't interested in those contexts, so they won't talk about them. So we only hear about building works in relation to the topics that interested later historians. But of course, they were really interested in Caliphal building works. Yeah, they do talk about building work during the Rashidun period. So the Prophet's mosque is some work is meant to have been undertaken during the Caliphate of Omar and during the Caliphate of Uthman. It was made slightly bigger during each of their caliphates, and some other changes were introduced as well. There's a fairly long history of scholarship debating the origins of the Prophet's mosque and whether the buildings built by people like Omar and Uthman related to the Prophet's house in Medina. But local historians do talk about those issues quite a lot. I do think that there's and maybe this is to jump forwards, there's a big difference though in the way they talk about building works in the Rashidun period and building works in the subsequent Umayyad period. So in the Rashidun period, they talk about, I suppose you could call them reasonably minor adjustments to slowly sort of piecemeal adjustments to buildings like the Prophet's Mosque, making them larger, adding a few features here and there. What you hear in the Umayyad period, and particularly with the Caliph Al-Walid at the very end of the 1st century Hijri, so the very early 8th century CE, there we get the impression of a complete overhaul, basically, a huge enlargement of the Prophet's Mosque, bringing the Prophet's grave within the mosque for the first time, within the structure of the mosque for the first time, creating a separate tomb enclosure to highlight, to commemorate the Prophet's grave, and adding other features as well. So corner towers or minarets, for example, are meant to have been added for the first time at this stage. So we seem to be getting information about something quite different in that period, a sort of almost a complete overhaul.
Yeah, and I found that to be the most interesting part about the building habits of Al-Walid and Umar, was that they expanded the enclosure of the mosque, or the boundaries of the mosque, to now include the tomb of the Prophet. And for me, that just sparks or provokes the thought about the tradition known by many as the Hadith of no two religions. But before I actually ask more about that, I was wondering, did Al-Walid and Umar receive any pushback for that endeavor? I mean, the hadith that I just mentioned, no two religions, is in the Muwatta of Ibn Malik, or of Malik ibn Anas, from what I understand. And being that I would think that that hadith was circulating in the region around that time. So I guess what I'm trying to find out, knowing that they had built, Umar, who was the governor of Medina, had built a shrine, or helped Al-Walid in building a shrine over the Prophet's grave, with the hadith of no two religions, where the Prophet kind of condemned other communities for building a place of worship over where the Prophets had been buried. And then also, hope that I'm still making sense. Also, I have a friend where I was talking to about Isnad Cum analysis on that hadith, and that he suspects it's dated to the time of Umar II, or Umar bin Abdulaziz Caliphate. But you also suspect that the hadith is a thinly veiled criticism of Umar's and Al-Walid's building of the mosque to expand, to incorporate the grave of the Prophet. So, just with all of that information, that I hope it's not too jumbled up, just for myself, with all of that information, I'm trying to figure out how do I reconcile it, because yeah, just knowing that Umar Abdulaziz, who is across the board praised in the Muslim world, even by people who are anti-shrine building over graves, to see that from him, yeah, it just kind of threw me for a loop.
Yeah, it's one of those interesting problems in the source material. So Al-Walid is the Caliph, and Omar ibn Abdulaziz, at this time, is his governor of Medina. Of course, he goes on to become Caliph himself later, but we're talking about the time when he's governor of Medina on behalf of Walid. So there's one wider context thing here that's important, is that Walid, this mosque being built in Medina in Walid's caliphate, is not the only structure that Walid is interested in. Walid builds mosques all over his, well, at least in Syria, Egypt, and Arabia. So he also builds mosques in Fustat, Old Cairo, in Sana'a in Yemen, and he's also does work on places like Mecca, mosques in Mecca, and the Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, and there are others as well. So this mosque in Medina fits within a wider context of Walid's caliphate and an interest in grand mosque building.
Okay.
So there's that context on the one hand. Yeah, on the other hand, there's this interesting question of building a monument that incorporates the Prophet's grave as part of it in a commemorative way. We do get signs of controversy at the time. So you mentioned one of these hadiths in which the Prophet criticizes other communities for taking the tombs of their prophets as sites of worship. And that can certainly be one way of reading that, is certainly as a critique of the actions of someone like Omar ibn Abdulaziz and Al-Walid in Medina. There are also other reports about sort of expressing fears of what would happen if you start sort of building work around the Prophet's grave. There are other accounts of people who were deeply worried about the implications of sort of disturbing the area. But I mean, the Caliph and his governor seem to have, if not ignored those, then reconciled themselves to the actions they decided to take. So I think what we can see is evidence of a dispute here between people who thought that the commemoration was the thing that should be done, or that actually, you know, it should that the area where the Prophet's buried should be left alone and not incorporated into the mosque. There does seem to have been a debate over that at the time. The fact that Omar is associated with both sides of the argument is in some ways just one of those contradictions or interesting problems in the sources that historians have to work their way around.
You know, and I wonder, because the prohibition of building places of worship over the tombs of prophets is also linked in the hadith with you know, kicking out all the other non-Muslim communities out of the Arabian Peninsula. Did that have anything to do with sanctifying the Medina or the Hijaz in any way, just by trying to get rid of other religious communities?
Yeah, I think there probably is an important link there. I think it's you refer to the someone you knew who'd done isnad analysis on some of these traditions. That I haven't done that, but when I worked on this topic, the general the feeling you get from a lot of the sources is that roughly the time of Omar ibn Abdulaziz is an important time in the development of this idea that the Hijaz is a land for Muslims only, and Mecca and Medina in particular are places that non-Muslims shouldn't visit. And I don't think it's a coincidence that those ideas develop at the same time as caliphs like Al-Walid are putting a lot of effort into building monuments that express the sanctity of places like Mecca and Medina as well, and they're clearly spending an awful lot of money on it. The building work in Medina that is undertaken was definitely not cheap, and it required the transportation of a lot of resources to Medina from elsewhere in the Caliphate.
To explain some of those resources, or how some of those resources were gathered, I found the tradition of the Umayyad Caliph appealing to Justinian II for, even though who knows how historical that is, I just found that tradition to be funny as an explanation on how he gathered some of the wealth to do it.
Yeah, this is a very famous story that so this has to be fitted into the context of quite frequent conflicts at this time between the Umayyad caliphs and the Byzantine emperors, and there are various stages of sort of truce and tribute paying and fighting and things. And at one point, we're told that one of the tributes that the Roman emperor is asked for, Justinian II, as you said, is asked for, is to provide so craftsmen and materials, particularly for mosaics, in the mosque in Medina. That, again, as you mentioned, it's a hard anecdote to work out the historicity of, and historians have discussed this at some length. But in a way, whatever the case, whether the resourcing came in part from the Roman Empire or not, it definitely came from outside the Hijaz. And in that sense, it's evidence of the, if you like, the imperial concern, the caliphal concern, the concern by imperial, sorry, I mean the caliphs and their concern to move to dedicate resourcing from around their empire to these projects in places like Medina, that shows it was important for them. And I think that does help to think of the context, to help give a context for those ideas in which the Hijaz is seen as a sort of exclusively Muslim holy land.
Even though I do wonder the historicity of that as well. If we were to really look at the landscape or look at on the ground, if the Hijaz really had rid itself of all its other non-Muslim communities. And you had also stated in your book that Al-Walid and Umar incorporating the grave of the Prophet Muhammad into the central mosque in Medina. It was the first time a place for where the Prophet is believed to be buried had become fixed. To me, that sounds like there was some kind of debate regarding the Prophet's final resting place. So prior to his grave becoming incorporated into the central mosque of Medina, was the exact location of the Prophet's grave a matter of controversy? And I do want to clarify, I keep calling it the central mosque of Medina. It's in the center of Medina, and Muslims, at least today, like calling like the primary mosque in the town, the central mosque. We here in Manchester, in London. So I guess I was just stuck in that habit. For anybody who needs clarification on why I keep calling it the central mosque of Medina.
I don't know that there was clearly a little bit of a debate about the place where the Prophet was buried, but it's not. It doesn't come. It's one of those issues on which dissenting opinions they can be found,
Mm,
but they're not. It wasn't a huge discussion in most sources. What is a bit of a topic of discussion is, and I think this is partly an example of scholars of all eras wanting to debate things in as much detail as possible.
yeah.
There is in local histories of Medina is a fair bit of discussion over the prophets, what at least from Walid's time onwards is this tomb enclosure in the mosque, is also meant to include at least two other graves as well, the caliphs Abu Bakr and Omar, and then there are traditions about a fourth grave being there as well uh, a few different figures are associated with that grave. But what there is debate over those three graves, the Prophet, Abu Bakr, and Omar, is the ways in which they're arranged
Mm.
within the tomb enclosure. That seems to be a topic of some interest to later local historians, but they don't seem particularly interested in questioning that the Prophet was buried basically in this place, if that makes sense.
No, definitely, definitely. And that you do go over this in your book for anybody who wants more clarification, and I can't recommend it enough for anybody interested in the development of the oasis of Yathrib into the holy city of Medina. And on the I, I wrote shrineization. Google Docs didn't give me no red line underneath, so I guess it's a word. But the shrineization of the prophet's grave, I would say, from how I understood your work, is what laid the foundation of the sacralizing of Medina, Medina's various sites in general. Because as you mentioned, and I quote from your book, it is a common phenomenon that once a primary shrine has been established in a sacred space or holy city, the secondary sites begin to develop. And at least from how I was reading your book, how you laid it out, it seems like that's exactly what happened. While the location of many commemorative sites had been forgotten by Ibn Zabala and Abu Ghassan, who we have mentioned, by their day in the late second, early ninth century, we do know of at least 11 sites where the prophet had prayed that were commemorated. Um, you also offer a map on these. Did you want to say something about?
Yeah, it's basically at the same time as, so the same people really associated with the expansion and sort of rebuilding of the Prophet's mosque in this period, Al-Walid and Omar ibn Abdul Aziz. They are also attributed with having built mosques in a number of other places around Medina. I personally think that there's not great evidence that those two figures were responsible for all of these mosques. They might have had some role in their development, but I think there's enough evidence that various other people had some role in the emergence of these sites as well. So I think we're talking about a phenomenon over the sort of that goes over the 2nd century Hijri, the 8th century CE here. But yes, what we see is as the Prophet's mosque is becoming established as the main central site in Medina, other sites are being identified around the rest of the oasis as well, that are then having commemorative structures built upon them, and these are often sites where the Prophet is said to have prayed. So, or something else happened of note in the Prophet's career. So there's a famous mosque at Quba, which is a couple of miles south of the Prophet's mosque, in the south of the oasis, and that this is meant to be the first site where the Prophet prayed after the Hijrah, when he arrived in the area, in the sort of wider Yathrib oasis. So that site gets identified round about the same time, and a mosque gets built there. So I think what we see there is, and this is what I think helps if we're thinking about how a place becomes a holy city, I think this is important, that it's not just about one central shrine, but it's about how the construction and the development of ideas about a central shrine also then lead to the development of other places with which some sort of sacred episode or holy aspect is connected elsewhere in the same area. And we really see over this century or so following Al-Walid and Omar's work on the Prophet's Mosque a rapid rise in the number of other sites around Medina identified with aspects from the Prophet's career, and commemorative structures built there. You mentioned earlier the graves of the martyrs of the Battle of Uhud. They seem to have been identified as a place that needed to be commemorated within that, or at least commemorated with built structures. People might, of course, have commemorated them earlier just without building anything there. But over this subsequent century, we start to see reports about monuments being built in that area to help to aid their commemoration.
Yeah, and you brought up a really good point. Just because there might not have been any construction or monument in that area at the time doesn't mean that people probably were not some kind of some small scale visitation. And that is another question I would like to ask when it comes to pilgrimage to Medina or pilgrimage to the Prophet's grave in general. There might not have. Well, I'll get to that. We'll talk about it when we get there. But I was quite surprised to read that after the Caliphate of Al-Walid bin Abdul Malik and the governorship of Umar bin Abdulaziz in Medina, there's no evidence of Marwanid caliphs patronizing any more sites around Medina. I would have thought that when Umar, as you mentioned earlier, became caliph after Al-Walid, around a decade after Al-Walid, he would continue the patronage of Medina to cement his own authority or to promote his authority as caliph. But you're saying we have nothing from him doing such.
Yeah, there's no particularly clear information of his interest in commemorative work in Medina while he was caliph. Perhaps we don't know, do we? Perhaps he thought his work there was done. Perhaps his caliphate was fairly short, and there were plenty of other important issues that needed dealing with at the time. So maybe he was distracted by everything elsewhere. But we don't hear an awful lot about further work in the Umayyad period in Medina after Walid and Omar's construction of the Prophet's Mosque. That changes a little bit. So in about 50 years after Walid's mosque is built, the Umayyads are overthrown and replaced by the Abbasid caliphs, and things do start to change a bit there. The earliest Abbasid caliphs show a little bit of interest in Medina, and the third Abbasid caliph, Al-Mahdi, he also undertakes a huge project on the Prophet's Mosque. He expands it again, so he expands it to the north significantly, so it becomes again a much bigger monument, and he adds extra features to the decorations. He adds a huge number of inscriptions to the courtyard of the Prophet's Mosque. Many of them are Quranic texts.
And so it would seem that the patronage of Medina is truly an Abbasid endeavor, because you see one Abbasid caliph doing it, another doing it after. It might be small scale, not to the extent that the Al-Walid may have, but I feel like with the Marwan, or with what Al-Walid and Umar, what they were doing, I don't know if I could call that a Marwanid endeavor, being that they were the only ones it started and stopped with them. At least from how I understand it, whereas the Abbasids seem more consistent throughout their caliphate in having maybe small scale building projects. It seems like they mostly focused on the mosque, although you did mention, as you kind of alluded to, that some of what has been attributed to Al-Walid and Umar were actually built by Abbasid caliphs, as well as what you call the politics of graves or grave politics, where Hamza al-Muttalib's grave is said to have been built or constructed by Umar, but that wouldn't have made sense in the context of the time.
Yeah, I think there's a few things that get attributed to Walid and Omar that I think are, if you like, if maybe lazy attributions by some sources, that they, because they're so famous for their work on the Prophet's mosque, people just thought they did a lot of the other stuff as well. Pardon me. Whereas actually, I think we do have evidence that some of those buildings were actually early Abbasid buildings rather than Umayyad ones. Yeah, you're right that the interest in Medina seems to be a bit more multi-generational in the early Abbasid period. The first three Abbasid caliphs all undertook at least some work on the Prophet's mosque, although Al-Mahdi's is by far the most expansive. After that, there isn't too much major work, but again, later Abbasid caliphs sort of, I don't know, tinker a little bit with the Prophet's mosque. They provide some new decoration, or they restore something if something needed restoration, things like that. Of course, Harun al-Rashid famously visits Mecca and Medina on numerous occasions as the caliph while he was caliph. So he associates himself with the town in that way, and comes, and the caliphs, when they visit Mecca and Medina, they're often said to have handed out large amounts of money to the local inhabitants. So presumably Harun visiting regularly led to a large influx of cash as well.
Okay.
For the locals.
You detail some of this in your most recent article, talking about the inscriptions around Medina. It was 70 pages. I got through maybe like 20. I didn't expect the article to be that long. Most articles are like 20 to 30 pages. I've seen that one was 70, and I had a few more other things to do, so I tried to read as much as I can. But a lot of what you were talking about seemed to be exactly in line with that article, and I recommend. And I'm going to finish it. I just have a lot on my plate, but I do recommend other people to go check it out, because I really do believe the end of your book is really good primer for that article, because you really do get into the inscriptions that the caliphs had instituted, detailing the building that they had undertook. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off right there, but I did want to plug in some promo for your article.
Thanks. Yeah, you're right. It's a very long article, but I suppose the point in short is that I think Medina was a very important place for the early Abbasids. Their if you like, their main rivals for once they've overthrown the Umayyads, their main rivals for the office of caliph are the Alids. And one of the most important Alid rebellions against the Abbasids comes in Medina. During the caliphate of the second Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur. In a way, it's not a sort of militarily significant rebellion. It gets defeated quite straightforwardly in the end. But what's the word? I guess ideologically, it's a very important challenge.
Yeah.
To the Abbasids, that the Alids are saying, we are essentially closer relations of the Prophet than you are, and the fact that this rebellion is in the Prophet's city, what is by then increasingly identified as the Prophet's city, is a direct challenge to Abbasid rule. So once the Abbasids have defeated that rebellion, they then seem to spend quite a lot of money investing in Medina and trying to show that they are the true sort of custodians of the Prophet's legacy.
Kind of like a PR stunt, to kind of make themselves.
In many ways, yeah.
All right. And no holy city is complete without pilgrimage. And this is pretty much the icing on the cake, or at least what I believe to be what seals the deal on Medina becoming seen as a holy city. And I'm pretty sure from this point on, it continues to grow, maybe. things become more available. You know, I'm not going to mince my words up by talking a bunch of nonsense, but there is no. I found this interesting that there's no documentary, and I want to interrogate this a little bit because it was a bit confusing for me. But there is no documentary evidence for a ziyarah or visitation pilgrimage to Medina for the first 4 or 5 centuries of Islam. Although certain narratives found in hadiths allegedly from the Prophet Muhammad, where he prayed at various mosques and encouraged their visitations, were in circulation around a couple centuries after his death, which provided justification for this practice. So how do we reconcile that there you do mention that there is hadith literature that exists that was in circulation around the early 8th century, maybe around the 8th century, but there's no documentary evidence of any kind of pilgrimage for the first 4 or 5 generations.
So by documentary evidence, I just mean that there are no surviving documents from that
Hmm.
period, be that, you know, a, a written like a written document on some form of material or an inscription or, you know, graffiti inscription. There's nothing like that, to my knowledge, that is in which somebody says basically I went on pilgrimage to Medina. That's all I mean. I don't
Okay.
that in a way that lack of evidence is not surprising. We don't have that much documentary evidence for much of Medina's early history anyway. So documentary evidence is quite rare anyway. So it's not, in a way, that's not that surprising. So then what I was focusing on were where you can see evidence for pilgrimage to Medina, and that comes often in debates in hadith literature.
Mm.
Sometimes this spills over into the same local histories that we were talking about earlier. And then eventually you start to get pilgrimage manuals, and guides to what to see in Medina, and, you know, what you should do at each of the sites. But and this is where it gets a bit tricky again. The usual caveat here is, just because we don't have evidence of something doesn't mean it wasn't happening.
Yeah.
So people presumably had, throughout the first century or two of Medina's Islamic history, had ideas about these sites, and, you know, many of them probably visited them and had ideas about what you should do, and people came from elsewhere in the Muslim world to visit them. But what we don't have clear ideas about often is
A formalized.
formalized ideas about pilgrimage. What seems to emerge first is a debate about basically whether you should travel to pray in Medina.
Mm.
So the earliest debates seem to revolve around whether it's legitimate to set out with the intention of praying somewhere other than to perform the Hajj in Mecca, if that makes sense.
No, definitely, definitely.
So that seems to be one of the earliest debates, maybe around the late first, early second, late 7th, early 8th century. So that would suggest that Medina was seen as I mean, if people are arguing this, it would suggest people were doing it. And it would also suggest other people didn't like that. So there is that debate is clearly there. And then a century or so after that, by the end of the, let's say, mid to end of the 3rd century, or 9th and 3rd century Hijri, the 9th century CE, we start to see debates about whether it's permissible to specifically set out to visit the Prophet's tomb.
Definitely.
Now, again, this is just the evidence, I think, for the emergence of these debates. It doesn't mean that people weren't doing it before that, and there is some evidence to suggest that people were, a sort of anecdotal evidence here and there to suggest that people were visiting the Prophet's grave before that.
But
But
what we do have evidence for, it seems like Shi'i scholars were the first to, or Imami Shi'i scholars were the first to initiate or construct a formalized, this is what you should do, at least from how I understood what I was reading from your book.
yeah, I think that, so the broader debate about how meritorious it is to visit the Prophet's tomb seems to be across Sunnism, Shiism. It seems
Okay.
that debate seems to be happening amongst many communities. What I think the Shia come up with, well, at least the earliest surviving examples of specific guides for how to, you know, what you should see in Medina, what order you should see things in Medina,
Mm.
how you should act at each of the sites. You know, here's the supplication that you should recite at this site. Here's you know, you should ablute and then recite this supplication at this site, and then you move on to the next one. That seems to emerge first in Shi'i literature, and then non-Shi'i literature follows along reasonably quickly afterwards. It's that exists. The debate, the idea about visiting the Prophet's grave seems to be like debated equally across Sunni and Shi'i sources, but the specific emergence of guides to specific actions for pilgrims and specific itineraries seems to emerge in Shi'i literature first, at least from what survives, at least so far as we can tell from what survives.
Okay. And I would like to get to the underlying motives behind the sanctification of Medina. We talked about how a lot of this stuff happened, developed, but really rarely touched on the intentions behind the people involved, maybe why they took such an initiative. Was it for political reasons, economic reasons, spiritual reasons, or whatnot? And the first two things that you kind of go over are economic recession and political resentment. Economic recession wasn't something that I had thought of initially for why or what motivated these the sanctification and these aggressive monumental buildings. But political resentment was definitely one thing that I had considered just by looking at how prestigious or how important Medina was in the early Islamic period, and then maybe some decades after, once Ali ibn Abi Talib lost his caliphate and everything. Well, even then, things were moving towards Iraq and Syria. I could see how there might have been a little bit of political resentment and the need to kind of reestablish or dig your feet into, hey, we are something in the Islamic world, and these are the reasons why Fada'il literature, commemorative buildings, but you don't believe it was exactly like that. I would like for you to just maybe describe why the economic recession is, you said it could be a good theory, but you don't lean towards it too much, and then why political resentment may not have been, might not be the whole story as well.
So really here I was responding to the arguments of a few earlier scholars about why ideas about Medina's, sort of why people might have promoted Medina's sanctity and its distinctive, you mentioned Medina's distinctive virtues, distinctive special merits. And people have suggested, some scholars have suggested it's like the locals, Medinans' way of responding to local economic decline, or local being seen as a sort of political backwater rather than the center of politics in the Islamic world. Yeah, no, I am skeptical. The economic side of things, I'm skeptical on for two reasons. Firstly, that I think the period that we've mostly been talking about, when Medina's sanctity is really being promoted, I don't think there is any great evidence of serious economic problems at that same time. Evidence that the Hijaz does seem to have a period of economic difficulty from the mid to late 3rd, 9th century onwards, but that's later. That's a bit later than the debates that we're talking about. The second reason is that I'm skeptical, and this applies to the political side of things as well. Like, whatever you think about Medinans' feelings of their political importance or not, the ideas about Medina as a holy city, the sanctification of the city, is not just a Medinan
phenomenon
in that sense. It's ideas about Medina, but it's not only the inhabitants of Medina who are having these discussions and promoting these ideas. We see Muslims across the Islamic world participating in these debates.
Yeah, the Hanafis had a real uphill battle in trying to convince people of Medina just being like any other city, because they had a whole lot of other people from different regions agreeing with Medinans on that.
Yeah, so I think like these debates, as we discussed the debate about the Haram amongst Hanafis and others in the last conversation, these debates are happening far outside Medina. I mean, Medinans are important participants in these debates, but they're by no means the only participants. And so I think the reasons that look too closely at what's going on in Medina provide a small part of the story, but we still have to explain why Muslims in Iraq, Syria, Khorasan are not particularly affected by local political feelings of dissatisfaction in Medina, even if those exist.
Yeah, I
So
found that very interesting because you mentioned other cities who have a similar history of becoming sanctified or sacralized, Kufa, Jerusalem, and if people in those regions were also fighting for the sanctity of Medina, I wonder how they viewed maybe the region they were in and the sanctity of maybe some of the sites they were near to. But the end of your book provoked so many thoughts. I swear some of the subheadings could have been monographs on their own, especially when you get to, and I'm sorry if I cut you off if you were still talking, um, especially the legacy of Muhammad. That right there could be in and of itself a whole separate work, and how, at least from documentary evidence, and I know you mentioned the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence, but at least uh, from what we can see of material evidence, the Muhammad really didn't emerge as a central figure, or, and I don't want to say a central figure or important figure, but let's say he rises another level when you start seeing his name mentioned on different forms of media, such as the first appearance being on a coin minted in Hijra 66, or in the Common Era 686 at Bishapur and Fars by a Zubairid governor. And from this time on, the name of Muhammad was seen on many more documentary material. You saw this as really what kind of aggravated or maybe motivated Al Walid, or maybe just the Umayyad caliphs in general, to do their aggressive building pride, as you mentioned, not only in Medina but in Jerusalem and in other places, Syria and whatnot. So I was wondering if you can explain that. I don't want to speak for you or with my own assumptions.
yeah, so whatever people thought about Muhammad and his legacy over the first 50, 60, 70 years after his death is very hard for us to understand. But something happens in the late first century where, at least as far as caliphs and their representatives are concerned, where official, or if you like, official texts that are made on behalf of the Caliphal government start to mention Muhammad and the Prophet much more frequently.
Mm.
Well, indeed, I mean, they don't seem to have, these types of documents don't seem to have ever mentioned him before, and they do from a point late, as you mentioned, that coin from Fars is usually and to my knowledge is still the earliest known
I
example.
haven't heard of it since before reading your book. I've never known of that coin. I always hear about the Dome of the Rock
Yeah,
being like one of the grandest expressions of solidifying or establishing Muhammad, or mentioning Muhammad, and separating Islam from other religions. But yeah, I just wanted to add that in there.
yes. The Dome of the Rock's a few years later, so it does happen on some coins first. And again, I suppose I am a bit cautious about what I say here because I'm a little unsure of how to interpret the evidence, but something has changed, right? That for caliphs and their ideas about how to promote their government, references to Muhammad and the caliph's position as his successors are, or somehow inheriting his legacy,
Mm.
has clearly become a crucial factor in how they promote the legitimacy of their rule. And alongside, or let's say a couple of decades after we start to see this development happening in documentary evidence and material culture, we start to see things like the huge expansion of the Prophet's Mosque in Medina by Walid. And I find it hard not to link these developments, that it's the generation of, it's Walid's father and other people, the Caliph Abdul Malik and other people in his generation who start this process, or it seems to be their generation that starts this process. So I don't see it as a coincidence at all that Walid takes that a next step further by commemorating the city associated with the Prophet, and the mosque in the center of that town, and bringing the Prophet's grave within it, and all the developments that we spoke about. So I think that in that sense, that context helps to explain why Medina becomes important to caliphs. And of course, I think that does have a knock on for other Muslims as well, because once once caliphs start spending money on building these lavish monuments, then other people start to engage with ideas about why those monuments are important.
And that's what you
And
see with,
that then kicks off further debates among Muslims more broadly. And then if I can just move that story forward, so that's the Umayyad period, and we mentioned in the Abbasid period they have the same, or not the same, they have a similar rationale for being interested in Medina, in that their main rivals for the Caliphal office are close relatives of the Prophet, and by this point it seems that establishing why you have inherited the Prophet's legacy rather than someone else is the most important claim to underpin your legitimacy as caliph. And so their work with Medina again fits into this context. So I think that's how the legacy of Muhammad and its connection to ideas about who the right caliph should be feed into what's going on in Medina.
And you just jumped ahead of a few of my questions, but I definitely thank you for that, which was just the reasons behind why the Umayyads were trying to attach themselves to the legacy of Muhammad. You explained that to solidify their Caliphal authority. With the Abbasids, why they were attaching themselves to Medina in order to attach themselves to the legacy of Muhammad is because they had just came out of, I don't know if you would call it the Abbasid revolution, but they were a part of a movement that dispossessed the Umayyad Caliphate, or the Caliphate from the Umayyads. And, they were in at least some of the people a part of that movement, they were looking to replace the Umayyads with who they called the chosen one, as you mentioned in your book, who is from the Ahlul Bayt. And I know the whole term Ahlul Bayt is a sticky one. I've read an article where even the Umayyads were trying to claim to be Ahlul Bayt. So the Abbasids were similarly trying to also direct some type of, I don't want to say attention, but direct that type of hoping that people would see them in the same light, basically. But I would like to, and we're towards the end of this interview. It's actually been a great two-part series. I really don't like doing two-part series, mainly because like you have like zest and motivation for the first one, but then sometimes the second one you just kind of lose that zest and motivation. But for this one, I actually really stayed engaged with this work throughout the whole thing. So it was definitely a delightful read and constructing this interview. But I would like to go over some of the reasons, or the reasons why the Prophet Muhammad created a haram in Medina in the first place. And just to quote a few things from your book, we should not assume that what Muhammad envisaged, I didn't even spell this word right, as a haram in the Constitution of Medina was particularly similar to that which many later Muslim scholars held that he established. So basically, we really shouldn't assume that the intentions of Muhammad, why he created a haram, were the same as those of later scholarship, which is something I really tried to keep in mind throughout the book. And just one more quote: "It is at least reasonable to propose that Muhammad established his own haram at Medina out of enmity towards those of Quraysh who had not followed him in his new religion, who had in fact expelled him from one sacred place, and a desire to highlight independence from them," which I really thought was a really interesting thesis, and one that I believe would makes total sense to me. Just if you look at it from a different within a certain perspective. And I know with academia it's more of especially when it comes to studying Islam, it's more of a secular approach to it, and my channel is pretty much a secular approach to it, so I'm not using that as a way of showing any type of contempt or anything like that. But I was just thinking maybe from a religious perspective, and this is something that a friend of mine put forth to me, who believes that the Prophet Muhammad never imagined in a million years that he would ever return to Mecca. So he saw his future and his community as Medina based, with no means of ever having a Hajj to Mecca. He therefore copied its haram and sanctified the region around his new mosque. And I'd just like to know what do you think about that thesis, especially given considering that we do know the revelation was didn't come down in like one complete form, but it transpired over 23 years. It does kind of seem to make sense, a little bit of sense that maybe if the revelation was a successive thing, that at one point in time Muhammad didn't think that he was going to go back to Mecca, and that he saw that Medina was the only place he was going to be. Probably never imagined that, just this probably never imagined that his religion would be as big as it was, maybe even leave outside of the Hijaz. So I was just wondering what you think about that thesis, and if you disagree, why do you disagree?
No, I think that's a really interesting idea. I think it it's important to, as this idea does, it's important to get around the problem of hindsight, of course, and of course we know that Muhammad and his community eventually were able to regain access to Mecca and indeed control Mecca, but of course they didn't have that knowledge at the time, well, before in the early years in Medina. So I think there is something to that. I think the way I would, and I think about those early years are quite, I think, along the lines that you're suggesting. I suppose I think it's for me it's when you put, and these are both, as we talked in the last conversation, incredibly difficult sources to use when thinking about what's going on. But so the Constitution of Medina on the one hand, and then the evidence of the Quran on the other hand. And the Constitution of Medina, of course, tells us that Yathrib was made, or the Jawf of Yathrib, the valley, was made a Haram, and so we know that was important to the Muhammad and his community in some way. And the Quran isn't interested, doesn't seem to be interested in that at all, and instead seems to be interested in this space, al-Masjid al-Haram, from which they've been expelled. And so I suppose I think I would, building on the idea you suggested, think about it as in Medina, the establishment of a haram, but not in an exclusive way, in a way that left open the possibility, if you like, of the return to Mecca.
Okay.
And the regaining of access to that haram as well, rather than. So I think there is something confrontational about the establishment of Medina's haram. The Constitution of Medina, the document in which we see the establishment of the haram, is pretty confrontational towards Quraysh, or at least those of Quraysh who didn't follow the Prophet. So there is a confrontational element to it. But I do think with the haram, I still think they seem to have left open the idea that Mecca,
Still go back to Mecca.
where Mecca was a space that they could get back to at some point.
And you see that even when they made Hijra to Ethiopia or to Abyssinia, that the moment they found out that it was okay for them to go back, even though it wasn't, they really tried. At least that's what the
Yeah.
tradition reports. They went back immediately. So, and we also hear reports of how living in Medina, the companions of the Prophet, or the Medinans, the Ansar, they longed for Mecca. They were getting so sick because they were in, but I think they blamed it on the stagnant water or something like that from some reports. But I just wanted to hear your thoughts about that. I think you put forth some really good ideas. I believe there was another one in there from R.B. Sergeant, why he thought maybe Muhammad had but I cannot remember it off the top of my head. Um, but yeah, if we'll just conclude with that. Is there any final words that you would like to leave us with? Anything you're working on? Do you plan on putting up an academia edu page so we can find your works? Because you have some really good articles out there. I mentioned one, or I mentioned two, two religions, which is one I encourage people to read, and your most recent on the inscriptions in and around Medina for the Prophet's Mosque.
Uh, are people interested in the articles? I mean, some of them are available open access off my university site, or people can get in touch with me for questions. No, I don't really have any other thoughts other than thanks very much for having me back for a second conversation.
Oh yeah, yeah. Thank you for being willing to take the time out of your busy schedule to do that. I really thought your book was a phenomenal work, and I hope to see more from you. If not in the same line of scholarship, whatever more you have in store for us to read, I'm definitely interested in. Maybe possibly have you back for, because I really would like to talk to you about the No Two Religions Hadith. Because I've known about that one for a long time, and my opinion, from being a very narrow-minded Muslim to having a better understanding of things. That's a hadith that I've probably thought about for not thought about, but just has been with me for a while. And I would just like to hear some of your insights on it as someone who has really looked into it from a very deep perspective. So, all right. All right. And thank you again. I can't thank you enough. These endings and goodbyes are always, you don't know really how to end, easier to start than end. But I guess we'll stop it right there. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you for your time again, Dr. Harry Munt.
Thank you.